Emily Crawford adjusted her diamond earrings for the third time, her reflection in the restaurant's mirrored wall, betraying none of the nervous energy coursing through her veins. The Metropolitan Club's main dining room hummed with the quiet conversations of Manhattan's elite. Crystal glasses, catching the warm light from chandeliers that had witnessed decades of power lunches and clandestine meetings. At 28, Emily had built her tech empire from a Columbia dorm room into a billion-dollar enterprise. But tonight, she felt as vulnerable as the freshman who once survived on ramen noodles and determination. Her fingers traced the edge of her phone screen. Where her assistant's last message glowed, Marcus Wellington confirmed for 8 p.m. Investment banker, Harvard MBA, comes highly recommended by the Rothschild family. The blind date had been arranged through Manhattan's most exclusive matchmaking service, a necessary evil in Emily's world where genuine connections were as rare as uncut diamonds. She had learned long ago that her wealth acted like a beacon, attracting those who saw dollar signs rather than the woman behind them. The burgundy dress she wore tonight cost more than most people's monthly salary, yet it felt like armor rather than adornment. Emily had chosen it carefully, knowing that every detail would be scrutinized, analyzed, and likely photographed by someone with a telephoto lens lurking outside. The irony wasn't lost on her that a woman who could buy anything she desired struggled to find something that couldn't be purchased: authentic love. Jason Miller pushed his cleaning cart through the service corridor adjacent to the Metropolitan Club's main dining room. His movements economical and practiced after 18 months of working the evening shift. The industrial wheels squeaked softly against the polished marble floor, a sound that had become as familiar to him as his own heartbeat. Through the narrow service window, he could observe the restaurant's patrons without being seen, a vantage point that had taught him to read the subtle languages of wealth and power. At 31, Jason carried himself with the quiet dignity of a man who had learned to find purpose in honest work, even when that work rendered him invisible to those he served. His custodial uniform was pressed and spotless, a small act of self-respect in a job that society often dismissed. Few knew that the janitor who emptied their trash and polished their floors held 2 master's degrees and had once commanded a 6-figure salary before a series of family tragedies and medical bills had reshaped his entire existence. Tonight felt different from the moment he'd clocked in. Jason's military training from his brief stint in the Army Reserve had left him with instincts that civilian life couldn't entirely dull. Something in the atmosphere of the club carried an undercurrent of tension that made his shoulders tight and his awareness heightened. He'd learned to trust these feelings during his deployment overseas, and they'd saved his life more than once. Emily checked her watch as 8:15 approached with no sign of her date. Marcus Wellington was now 15 minutes late, which in Manhattan's high society was either a power play or a red flag. She sipped her champagne slowly, aware that every solo minute at the reserved table made her more conspicuous. The other diners had begun to notice her solitude, their glances carrying the mixture of curiosity and pity that successful women dining alone inevitably attracted. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Emily, so sorry, running late due to traffic. Give me 10 more minutes. Can't wait to meet you. Marcus." The message should have provided relief, but something about its tone felt off. Emily had conducted enough high-stakes negotiations to develop a sixth sense for deception, and the overly casual language didn't match the formal, articulate man her assistant had described from their phone conversation. Jason repositioned his cart near the service entrance that offered the clearest view of the dining room. His attention was drawn to a woman sitting alone at table 12, her posture perfect despite the obvious discomfort of being stood up. Even from this distance, he could see the intelligence in her dark eyes and the way she carried herself with natural grace that no finishing school could teach. She was beautiful in a way that seemed almost incidental to her presence, as if her looks were simply one facet of a much more complex person. A movement caught his peripheral vision, and Jason's blood chilled. Across the dining room, near the main windows facing Fifth Avenue, a small red dot of light danced briefly across the wall before settling with laser precision on the chest of the woman at table 12. Jason's military training kicked in immediately, his mind cataloguing the angle, the likely position of the shooter, and the deadly intent behind that crimson point of light. Without conscious thought, Jason abandoned his cart and moved with swift purpose through the service corridor toward the main dining room. Every second counted now. The woman had no idea she was in someone's crosshairs. Her attention focused on her phone as she typed what appeared to be a response to a message. The laser sight remained steady on her heart, and Jason calculated he had perhaps seconds before whoever was controlling it decided to pull the trigger. Emily was composing a polite text, declining to wait any longer, when she became aware of rapid footsteps approaching her table. She looked up to see a man in a custodial uniform moving toward her with urgent intensity. For a split second, fear flashed through her mind. In her world, unexpected approaches from strangers often meant danger of various kinds. But something in his eyes stopped her from calling for security. Jason reached her table just as he caught sight of a muzzle flash from a building across the street. Without hesitation, he wrapped his arms around Emily and pulled her down and to the side, his body shielding hers as they both tumbled to the floor behind the solid mahogany table. The restaurant's large window exploded inward simultaneously, showering the space where Emily had been sitting with deadly shards of glass and the whistle of a high-velocity bullet. The dining room erupted into chaos. Screams pierced the air as patrons dove under tables or ran for the exits. The sounds of shattering glass and overturning furniture created a symphony of panic that Jason had heard too many times in other contexts. His arms remained protective around Emily, his body a living shield as he assessed their immediate safety and calculated their next moves. Emily's world had compressed to the solid warmth of the stranger's chest against her back, the steady rhythm of his breathing in her ear, and the acrid smell of gunpowder that now filled the air. Her mind struggled to process what had just happened. One moment she'd been alone and frustrated about being stood up. The next, she was pressed against the floor with someone's life potentially saved by a man whose name she didn't even know. Jason's voice was low and calm against her ear, his tone carrying the authority of someone accustomed to crisis situations. "Stay down. Don't move until I tell you it's safe." That shot came from the building across the street, probably the 20th floor based on the angle. There might be more. His hands were gentle but firm, positioning her body to remain protected by the heavy table while he scanned for additional threats. The police sirens began as distant wails that grew rapidly closer. Jason knew their immediate danger was likely over. Professional snipers rarely attempted multiple shots once their position was compromised and chaos had erupted. But he also understood that whoever had targeted this woman had resources and planning behind them. This wasn't a random act of violence or a crime of passion. Someone had specifically wanted Emily Crawford dead. Emily turned her head slightly to look at the man who had saved her life. His face was inches from hers, and she could see details that the chaos somehow made more vivid rather than less. He had kind eyes despite the intensity of the moment, with small lines that spoke of laughter and deeper creases that suggested he'd seen more of life's difficulties than his apparent age would normally accumulate. There was a small scar above his left eyebrow and calluses on his hands that spoke of physical work. The realization hit her like cold water. This janitor had risked his life for a complete stranger. In Emily's world, people calculated angles and potential benefits before making significant gestures. Genuine altruism was so rare in her experience that she'd almost forgotten what it looked like. Yet here was a man who had thrown himself between her and a bullet, without knowing who she was or what she might be able to offer him in return. Jason maintained his protective position until the first police officers entered the restaurant, their weapons drawn and voices commanding order from chaos. Only then did he slowly help Emily to a sitting position behind the table, his movements careful and deliberate. His eyes continued to scan the room and the broken window, professional habits that civilian life hadn't entirely erased. The next hour passed in a blur of police interviews, paramedic examinations, and crime scene photographers, capturing every angle of the attempted assassination. Emily found herself repeatedly looking across the restaurant to where Jason was giving his statement to a detective, her mind still processing the surreal transition from routine blind date to life-threatening attack to salvation by a stranger. Detective Maria Santos approached Emily's table with the weary expression of someone who had seen too much violence in her 15 years with the NYPD. Her questions were thorough and professional, covering everything from Emily's business dealings to her personal relationships to any recent threats she might have received. The detective's tone suggested this wasn't being treated as a random shooting or a case of mistaken identity. Emily's responses were honest but incomplete. She couldn't think of anyone who would want her dead, though she acknowledged that her business success had inevitably created competitors and disappointed parties. Her romantic life was notably sparse, precisely because she'd learned to be suspicious of people's motives. The irony that she'd been saved while waiting for a date that had likely been a setup wasn't lost on either woman. Jason's interview with Detective Rodriguez covered his background more thoroughly than most witnesses would expect. His military service, his current employment, his vantage point at the time of the shooting, and his split-second decision to intervene all came under scrutiny. The detective seemed impressed by Jason's clear recollection of details and his tactical assessment of the situation, but also curious about how a janitor had reacted with such professional competence. As the immediate crisis began to wind down and the restaurant slowly emptied of law enforcement and emergency personnel, Emily found herself alone with her racing thoughts and the delayed shock of what had nearly happened. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the interview process began to ebb, leaving her feeling strangely hollow and disconnected from her own body. Jason finished with the police and began to collect his scattered cleaning supplies, his movements automatic as his mind processed the evening's events. He'd given the authorities everything he could remember, but he knew the investigation would likely consume weeks or months before producing answers. Professional hits weren't solved quickly, and whoever had ordered this one had demonstrated both resources and patience in planning it. Emily approached Jason as he loaded his cart, her designer heels crunching softly on broken glass that the crime scene team hadn't yet cleared. The restaurant felt enormous and eerily quiet now that most of the chaos had subsided. She realized she was about to thank a man whose name she still didn't know, who had saved her life without expecting anything in return, and who would probably disappear back into the invisible workforce that kept Manhattan functioning. Their eyes met across the debris of overturned chairs and scattered table settings. Emily saw exhaustion there, but also a quiet strength that she recognized as authentic in a way that most of her interactions had taught her to doubt. Jason saw vulnerability beneath her composed exterior, the kind of genuine emotion that wealth and power couldn't entirely shield. They were two people from completely different worlds who had been thrust together by violence and chance. Jason spoke first, his voice carrying the same calm authority that had guided her through the immediate aftermath of the shooting. "Are you all right? I mean, really all right? Sometimes the shock hits later." His concern seemed genuine rather than calculated, another rarity in Emily's experience. She found herself wondering how long it had been since someone had asked about her well-being without an underlying agenda. Emily's response surprised her with its honesty. "I don't think I am, actually. I keep thinking about what would have happened if you hadn't been there. If you hadn't acted so quickly." Her voice carried a tremor that she couldn't entirely suppress. The first crack in the composure she'd maintained throughout the police interviews and medical examinations. The weight of unspoken questions hung between them. Why had someone wanted her dead? How had this man recognized the danger when no one else had noticed? What did it mean that a stranger had risked everything to save her, while someone else had planned meticulously to end her life? The contrasts were almost too stark to process. Jason set down the cleaning supplies he'd been gathering and gave Emily his full attention. In the harsh fluorescent light that had replaced the restaurant's ambient lighting, he could see the shock beginning to manifest in small tremors and the pallor that often followed extreme stress. His instinct was to ensure she got proper support, but he also recognized that her world probably didn't include many people she could genuinely trust with vulnerability. Emily found herself studying Jason's hands as he spoke, noting again the calluses and scars that spoke of physical work and possibly other experiences she couldn't identify. These weren't the soft, manicured hands of the men in her usual social circle. They looked like hands that could fix things, build things, protect things. The thought struck her as oddly comforting rather than concerning. The conversation continued in fits and starts, punctuated by the sounds of investigators still working in adjacent areas of the restaurant. Emily learned that Jason's full name was Jason Miller, that he'd been working at the Metropolitan Club for over a year, and that he lived somewhere in Queens. The information felt both insufficient and somehow complete, as if the important parts of a person couldn't be conveyed through biographical details anyway. Jason discovered that the woman he'd saved was Emily Crawford, though her name meant more to him than she initially realized. He'd read about her company's innovations in renewable energy technology, admiring the practical applications that could genuinely improve people's lives. Learning that the brilliant CEO he'd respected from a distance was the same person whose life he'd just saved added another layer of surrealism to the evening's events. As they talked, both became aware of an unexpected comfort in each other's presence. The extreme circumstances had stripped away the usual social barriers and pretenses that might have prevented any meaningful interaction between a billionaire CEO and a custodial worker. In the aftermath of shared trauma, their conversation felt remarkably honest and unguarded. Emily mentioned that she lived alone in a penthouse overlooking Central Park, and Jason could hear the loneliness behind the prestigious address. The way she described her life sounded like a beautiful cage, surrounded by luxury, but isolated from genuine human connection. He understood isolation, though his came from economic circumstances rather than wealth. Jason's own living situation emerged gradually through their conversation. He rented a small apartment in Astoria, worked 2 jobs to support his aging mother's medical expenses, and spent his free time reading or maintaining the small garden he'd cultivated on his building's fire escape. His life sounded rich in purpose, but constrained by financial realities that Emily couldn't fully comprehend. The detective who had interviewed Emily earlier approached their impromptu conversation with additional questions and instructions. Emily would need enhanced security until the investigation progressed further. The attack appeared to be professionally planned, which meant the threat might persist until the perpetrators were identified and apprehended. Her normal life was effectively suspended indefinitely. Jason listened as the detective outlined the security protocols Emily would need to follow. The recommendations included changing her residence temporarily, varying her routines dramatically, and limiting her public appearances. He could see her composure begin to crack as the full implications became clear. Her world was about to become even smaller and more isolated than it already was. As the evening drew to a close and the restaurant finally began to empty of official personnel, Emily realized she was facing a drive home alone to an apartment that might not be safe, followed by an indefinite period of hiding from an unknown enemy. The independence she'd cultivated so carefully suddenly felt like a liability rather than a strength. Jason offered to accompany her home, not as security, but simply as someone who understood what she'd experienced that evening. The offer was practical rather than romantic, born from recognition that trauma processing often went better with companionship. Emily accepted with a gratitude that surprised them both, acknowledging that she didn't want to be alone, with her racing thoughts and newfound paranoia. The ride to Emily's building passed mostly in silence, both of them processing the evening's events and the strange intimacy that shared danger had created between strangers. The taxi's motion felt soothing after the jarring violence of the shooting, and Emily found herself relaxing slightly for the first time in hours. Jason's presence beside her felt steadying in a way she couldn't entirely explain. He wasn't trying to fill the silence with meaningless reassurances or inappropriate questions about her wealth and lifestyle. Instead, he seemed content to simply be present, offering the comfort of companionship without demands or expectations. The contrast with her usual social interactions was stark and oddly refreshing. Emily's building loomed against the Manhattan skyline like a monument to architectural ambition, its glass and steel facade reflecting the city lights in patterns that shifted with their approach. Jason had seen it from a distance many times, but never imagined he'd enter it as a guest. The doorman's polite but thorough security screening reminded both of them of the world they were entering and the vast differences in their normal lives. The elevator ride to the 62nd floor felt interminable, marked by the soft hum of machinery and the gradual pressure changes that accompanied their ascent above the city. Emily watched the floor numbers change and realized she was bringing a virtual stranger into her most private space. Yet she felt safer with Jason than she'd felt alone in months. Emily's penthouse revealed itself gradually as they entered, room by room, showcasing the kind of understated luxury that only true wealth could afford. The space was beautiful but somehow sterile, decorated with exquisite taste, but lacking the personal touches that would make it feel like a home rather than a showcase. Jason noticed the absence of family photos, personal mementos, or signs of hobbies and interests beyond work. The view from Emily's living room windows was breathtaking, offering a panoramic display of Manhattan that included Central Park, the Hudson River, and countless lights stretching toward the horizon. Jason had seen the city from many angles during his various jobs, but never from this perspective of complete elevation above its energy and chaos. Emily moved through her apartment with the automatic efficiency of someone performing a familiar routine, checking locks and activating security systems that Jason hadn't realized existed. The level of protection already built into her daily life spoke to threats and concerns that predated the evening's attack. Her world had been shaped by danger long before tonight made it explicit. As they settled into the living room with coffee, that Emily prepared herself despite having household staff, their conversation gradually shifted from the immediate trauma to more personal territory. The extreme circumstances had created a strange bubble of honesty between them, where normal social barriers seemed temporarily suspended. Emily found herself talking about her childhood, growing up with parents who were brilliant but emotionally distant, who had taught her to excel academically and professionally, but hadn't modeled healthy relationships or emotional expression. Her success had been built on their foundation of high expectations and limited warmth, creating someone who could navigate corporate boardrooms but struggled with intimate connections. Jason shared his own background more gradually, revealing a life marked by service and responsibility from an early age. His father had died when Jason was 16, leaving him to help support his younger sister and mother while finishing high school. Military service had provided structure and purpose, But family medical crises had derailed his original career plans and led him through a series of increasingly humble jobs. The coffee grew cold as their conversation continued deep into the night, both of them finding unexpected comfort in the honest exchange. Emily couldn't remember the last time she talked to someone who seemed genuinely interested in her thoughts and experiences rather than what she could provide them. Jason was struck by her intelligence and vulnerability, qualities that her public persona kept carefully hidden. As dawn began to lighten the sky beyond Emily's windows, they both realized that the night had transformed something fundamental between them. What had started as a stranger saving her life had evolved into a connection that neither had expected or planned. The circumstances were extraordinary, but the feelings developing between them felt remarkably natural and unforced. Emily looked at Jason as morning light began to illuminate his features and realized she was falling in love with a man she'd known for less than 12 hours. The recognition was startling but undeniable, based not on his looks or status, but on the kindness, courage, and genuine humanity he'd demonstrated consistently since the moment he'd saved her life. Jason saw Emily's beauty enhanced rather than diminished by exhaustion and emotional honesty, her carefully maintained facade replaced by something far more appealing. He was falling for a woman whose world was completely different from his own, but whose fundamental loneliness and desire for authentic connection mirrored his own deepest needs. The investigation into the assassination attempt progressed slowly over the following weeks, with Emily maintaining a low profile while detectives pursued leads that seemed to multiply rather than narrow. She worked from secure locations and communicated with her company primarily through encrypted channels, her normal routine completely disrupted by necessary security precautions. Jason found himself thinking about Emily constantly during his work shifts, their night-long conversation replaying in his memory as he went through the motions of his custodial duties. The connection they'd formed felt real and significant, but he also recognized the practical impossibilities of bridging their very different worlds. Emily used her enforced isolation as an opportunity to examine her life with unprecedented honesty. The attack had clarified how little genuine happiness her success had brought her, and her conversation with Jason had reminded her what authentic human connection could feel like. She began to understand that her wealth had become a barrier to rather than a facilitator of the relationship she actually wanted. Their second meeting happened by careful arrangement rather than chance, Emily's security team coordinating with Jason's work schedule to ensure a safe encounter. The formality required made their interaction feel both precious and slightly artificial, as if the spontaneous honesty of their first night together couldn't quite be replicated under controlled circumstances. Emily had chosen a small cafe in Queens, near Jason's neighborhood, but far from her usual Manhattan haunts. The location required her to dress down significantly and travel with minimal security, choices that felt both liberating and terrifying after weeks of heightened protection. She arrived early and claimed a corner table that offered good sightlines and quick exit options. Jason entered the cafe with the punctuality of someone who respected other people's time, his casual clothes and relaxed demeanor helping Emily remember that he was more than the hero who had saved her life. He was also simply a man whose company she enjoyed, whose perspective on life differed refreshingly from everyone else in her social circle. Their conversation picked up naturally from where their first night had ended, covering everything from Emily's business philosophy to Jason's thoughts on urban gardening, to their shared appreciation for old movies and live jazz. The ease between them was remarkable given their short acquaintance, suggesting compatibility that went deeper than their dramatically different circumstances. Emily found herself studying Jason's expressions as he talked about his work, noting how he spoke about the building's tenants with genuine care and respect, despite the fact that most of them probably never acknowledged his existence. His dignity and professionalism in the face of social invisibility impressed her more than any corporate achievement she'd witnessed. Jason listened as Emily described the isolation that accompanied her success, the difficulty of forming relationships when people's motives were always suspect, and her growing realization that professional achievement without personal happiness was ultimately hollow. Her vulnerability was genuine and carefully shared, not the calculated disclosure of someone managing her image. As their coffee date extended into lunch and then into an afternoon walk through Jason's neighborhood, Emily experienced Queens through his eyes. He pointed out community gardens maintained by immigrant families, small businesses that had survived decades of economic change, and the subtle signs of gentrification that were gradually altering the area's character. The neighborhood reminded Emily of communities she'd known briefly in childhood, before her family's wealth had isolated them in increasingly exclusive environments. She'd forgotten how much life existed in the interactions between neighbors, the multi-generational conversations on front steps, and the organic social networks that formed around shared spaces and common concerns. Jason's small apartment revealed itself as a space of careful beauty created through ingenuity rather than expense. Books lined makeshift shelves, plants thrived in every window, and personal photographs documented relationships that clearly brought him joy. The space felt more like a home than Emily's penthouse, despite costing a fraction of her monthly housing expenses. Emily met Jason's elderly neighbor, Mrs. Chen, who had become like a grandmother to him after his own grandmother's death. The older woman's obvious affection for Jason and her protective curiosity about Emily suggested a community of care that Emily hadn't experienced since her own childhood. She envied the simple authenticity of their relationship. As evening approached and Emily needed to return to her secure location, both of them recognized that their connection was deepening despite the practical obstacles to any future together. Their different worlds weren't just matters of wealth and status, they represented completely different approaches to life, relationships, and definitions of success. The investigation took a dramatic turn when police arrested Marcus Wellington, the man who had supposedly been Emily's blind date. He turned out to be a hired assassin using a false identity, paid by a consortium of Emily's business competitors who had decided her innovative patents posed an existential threat to their established industries. The arrest provided Emily with relief and vindication, but also a sobering reminder of how her success had painted a target on her back. The conspiracy against her was broader and more sophisticated than she'd imagined, involving millions of dollars and months of planning. Her paranoia, it turned out, had been insufficient rather than excessive. With the immediate threat neutralized, Emily's life began to return to something resembling normalcy. She resumed working from her office, attending necessary meetings, and rebuilding the routines that had been disrupted by weeks of security protocols. But the experience had changed her perspective on what constituted a life worth protecting. Emily found herself restructuring her priorities, delegating more operational responsibilities to trusted executives, while focusing on the innovative work that had originally attracted her to technology. She also began deliberately seeking more authentic relationships, starting with honest conversations with employees she'd previously known only professionally. Jason continued his custodial work, but with a new awareness of how his life had been impacted by saving Emily. The media attention following the arrest had briefly made him a minor celebrity, which he'd handled with the same quiet dignity he brought to everything else. More significantly, he'd begun to envision possibilities for his future that extended beyond simple survival and family responsibility. Their relationship continued to develop through carefully arranged meetings that respected both Emily's security needs and Jason's work schedule. They discovered shared interests in environmental conservation, social justice issues, and the practical applications of technology to improve people's lives. Their conversations challenged both of them to think more broadly about their roles in society. Emily began using her wealth more strategically to support causes they both cared about, funding community gardens in Jason's neighborhood and scholarships for students from working-class backgrounds pursuing environmental engineering. The philanthropy felt more meaningful than her previous charitable giving because it was connected to personal relationships and direct observation of need. Jason started taking night classes in sustainable technology, using educational benefits from his military service that he'd previously been too busy to pursue. Emily's encouragement and his growing confidence in their relationship gave him permission to imagine a future that included professional growth, rather than just economic survival. The class differences that had initially seemed insurmountable began to feel less significant as they focused on shared values and complementary strengths. Emily's business acumen and resources paired naturally with Jason's practical experience and community connections. They started discussing projects they might tackle together, combining her innovation with his understanding of real-world implementation. Their first real date, free from security concerns and investigative pressure, took place at a jazz club in Greenwich Village that Jason had discovered years earlier. The intimate venue and live music created an atmosphere where they could simply be two people enjoying each other's company, rather than a billionaire and a janitor navigating an unlikely romance. Emily wore a simple dress that cost more than Jason's monthly rent, but her wealth felt less relevant in the dim lighting and authentic atmosphere of the club. She danced with him to slow songs, feeling the strength in his arms and the steadiness of his movement that reflected his character in physical form. Jason held Emily close as they swayed to the music, acutely aware that he was falling in love with someone whose life was vastly more complicated than his own, but whose essential loneliness and desire for connection mirrored his perfectly. The music and movement allowed them to communicate without words, expressing feelings that were still too new and fragile for explicit discussion. As their relationship deepened over the following months, they each made adjustments to accommodate the other's world. Emily learned to find joy in simple pleasures, community dinners in Jason's neighborhood, weekend mornings reading together in his plant-filled apartment, and conversations with people whose concerns were immediate and practical rather than abstract and strategic. Jason gradually became comfortable in Emily's environment, learning to navigate charity galas and business dinners with the same quiet confidence he brought to every other social situation. He impressed Emily's colleagues with his thoughtful questions and practical insights, earning respect based on his character rather than his economic status. The media eventually discovered their relationship, creating a brief sensation about the billionaire CEO dating her blue-collar hero. Emily handled the attention with grace while protecting Jason's privacy as much as possible. Their genuine connection was strong enough to withstand public curiosity and speculation. Emily's board of directors expressed initial concern about her relationship affecting the company's image, but her continued professional excellence and Jason's dignified public behavior gradually neutralized opposition. Some of Emily's wealthy friends struggled to understand the relationship, but those worth keeping ultimately supported her happiness regardless of its unconventional source. Jason's family and friends were initially suspicious of Emily's motives, wondering if their relationship was some kind of elaborate charity project or publicity stunt. But Emily's consistent presence at family gatherings and her genuine care for Jason's mother during a health crisis eventually won them over completely. Their love story became something of a modern fairy tale, but one grounded in real challenges and authentic emotions rather than fantasy transformations. Neither Emily nor Jason changed their fundamental natures. Instead, they learned to appreciate and support each other's strengths while addressing their individual vulnerabilities. Emily discovered that sharing her wealth in service of causes she believed in brought her far more satisfaction than accumulating luxury possessions. Jason found that his practical skills and community connections were valuable assets that complemented rather than competed with Emily's resources and vision. They established a foundation together focused on sustainable technology education and community development, combining Emily's business expertise with Jason's understanding of working-class needs and community dynamics. The work gave both of them a sense of purpose that transcended their individual careers. A year after the assassination attempt that had brought them together, Emily and Jason stood on the roof garden of their newly purchased building in Jason's neighborhood. They had converted the upper floors into a comfortable home that reflected both of their personalities, while the lower floors housed the foundation's offices and community meeting spaces. The garden surrounded them with the fruits of their collaborative effort, vegetables that would feed neighborhood families, flowers that brought beauty to an urban environment, and fruit trees that would provide shade and sustenance for years to come. The space embodied their shared belief that practical beauty and community benefit could coexist with personal happiness. Emily looked at Jason as he checked the drip irrigation system he'd designed and installed, noting how his quiet competence and genuine care for others had become the foundation of her own happiness. She had never imagined that love could feel so steady and sure, built on respect and shared values rather than passion and need. Jason caught Emily's gaze and smiled with the same warmth that had first attracted her to him, enhanced now by the intimacy of truly knowing and being known by another person. Their love had grown from dramatic circumstances into something both ordinary and extraordinary. Two people who had found in each other exactly what they hadn't known they were missing. The city stretched out below them, millions of lights representing millions of lives, each carrying their own stories of connection and isolation, hope and disappointment, love found and love lost. Emily and Jason's story was just one among many, but it was theirs, built on the foundation of one person's willingness to risk everything to save a stranger's life, and another person's recognition that authentic love was worth more than any amount of wealth or status. As evening settled over Queens and Manhattan began to glitter in the distance, they stood together in their garden, hands intertwined, watching the sun set on a day that had brought them closer to the life they were building together. The future stretched ahead of them, uncertain in its details, but secure in its foundation of mutual respect, shared purpose, and love that had been tested by extraordinary circumstances and proven genuine through ordinary moments. Their story had begun with violence and danger, but it would continue with the quiet dailiness of two people who had found in each other the authentic connection that both had been seeking without fully understanding what they needed. Love, they had learned, was not about finding someone who completed you, but about finding someone with whom you could be completely yourself while working together to build something larger than either of you could create alone. The wedding took place 2 years later in the same rooftop garden where they had first envisioned their shared future. Emily wore her grandmother's simple pearl necklace with a dress that cost less than many of her business suits, while Jason stood beside her in a carefully tailored suit that he had saved months to purchase. The guest list included Emily's remaining loyal friends, alongside Jason's extended family and neighborhood community, creating an unlikely but harmonious gathering. Mrs. Chen, now 91 and moving slowly but with fierce determination, served as the unofficial matriarch of the celebration. She had spent weeks preparing traditional dishes alongside Emily's caterers, insisting that the wedding feast should represent both families' cultures and traditions. Her obvious pride in Jason and growing affection for Emily had sealed their acceptance in the tight-knit Queen's community. Emily's parents attended with polite bewilderment, still struggling to understand how their achievement-oriented daughter had chosen love over strategic advancement. But they could see her genuine happiness, something that had been absent during her years of relentless professional climbing, and their gradual acceptance meant more to Emily than their enthusiastic approval would have. The ceremony itself was brief and intimate, officiated by the community center director who had known Jason since childhood. Their vows focused on partnership rather than possession, promising to support each other's growth while building something meaningful together. Emily spoke about learning that true security came from authentic relationships rather than financial independence. Jason promised to continue seeing Emily's heart rather than her circumstances, just as she had learned to value his character over conventional measures of success. The reception flowed seamlessly from formal dinner to neighborhood block party, with children from nearby apartments joining the dancing as evening approached. Emily found herself playing impromptu games with kids who saw her simply as Jason's wife rather than a business celebrity, experiencing a kind of uncomplicated social interaction she had forgotten existed. As their wedding night began in the apartment they now shared, Emily and Jason reflected on the journey that had brought them from a moment of life-threatening danger to this celebration of life-affirming love. Neither could have imagined 2 years earlier that an assassination attempt would lead to the deepest happiness either had ever known. Their foundation had grown into a significant force for community development, employing dozens of people from Jason's neighborhood while implementing Emily's technological innovations in practical ways that improved daily life. The work satisfied Emily's need for meaningful impact while utilizing Jason's understanding of how solutions actually functioned in real-world conditions. Jason had completed his degree in environmental engineering with Emily's financial support and his own relentless effort, graduating summa cum laude and immediately joining their foundation as its technical director. His combination of academic knowledge and practical experience made him uniquely qualified to bridge the gap between innovative theory and effective implementation. Emily had learned to find joy in smaller victories and immediate impact rather than only pursuing massive, long-term achievements. Working directly with community members had taught her that sustainable change happened through relationships and trust rather than just funding and technology. Her business philosophy had evolved to prioritize human benefit over pure profit maximization. Their love had been tested by public scrutiny, family skepticism, and the ongoing challenges of merging very different lifestyles and expectations. But each challenge had ultimately strengthened rather than weakened their bond, proving that their initial connection was based on genuine compatibility rather than dramatic circumstances or temporary gratitude. As they settled into married life, Emily and Jason discovered that their greatest happiness came from ordinary moments. Morning coffee shared while planning foundation projects, evening walks through their evolving neighborhood, quiet conversations about books they had both read, and the simple comfort of sleeping beside someone who truly knew and accepted them completely. Their story had become a testament to the possibility of authentic love transcending social and economic barriers when both people were willing to value character over convention and connection over status. They had each found in the other exactly what they needed. Emily had discovered that genuine security came from being truly known and loved, while Jason had learned that his worth extended far beyond his economic circumstances. The assassination attempt that had brought them together was now rarely discussed, remembered mainly as the dramatic catalyst that had made possible everything beautiful that followed. Emily occasionally wondered what would have happened if she had never been targeted, if Jason had never had the opportunity to save her life, if they had somehow met under ordinary circumstances. But such speculation felt pointless, given the extraordinary happiness they had built together. Their marriage represented more than personal fulfillment. It had become a symbol within their community that love could bridge any gap when it was based on mutual respect, shared values, and genuine commitment to each other's well-being. Young people from both their backgrounds looked to them as proof that authentic relationships were possible despite societal pressures and economic realities. 5 years after their first meeting, Emily and Jason stood once again in their rooftop garden, now expanded and flourishing beyond their original vision. They were surrounded by the fruits of their literal and metaphorical cultivation. Vegetables feeding dozens of families, flowers beautifying the entire neighborhood, and fruit trees that would provide for generations to come. Emily held their 6-month-old daughter, Sophia, while Jason checked the irrigation system that now served not just their building, but several others in the community. Their child would grow up understanding that love was measured by actions rather than possessions, that security came from community rather than isolation, and that the greatest wealth was having people who truly cared about your happiness. As the sun set over Queens and Manhattan glittered in the distance, Emily and Jason stood together in the garden they had created, holding the child they had made, surrounded by the community they had helped nurture. Their love story had begun with violence and fear, but it continued with hope and purpose, proving that even the darkest moments could lead to the brightest futures when two people chose to face them together with courage, compassion, and unwavering commitment to each other's authentic happiness.